apologize to her. You are making a mistake.
I know that bracelet.
The projections are solid.
It's done.
No, that's impossible.
I didn't freeze everything because of a bracelet. I froze everything because you thought I would never fight back.
Apologize to her. Preston Hale said those 3 words in front of the entire boardroom, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that expected no resistance, his eyes fixed on Maren Tate as though she were the disruption, and not the woman who had noticed a piece of jewelry that had no business being on someone else's wrist. Celeste Mercer stood a few feet to his left, her posture straight, a faint smile playing at the corner of her mouth, the kind that comes from believing you have already won. The bracelet on Celeste's wrist was a custom commission from a jeweler on the Upper West Side, charged to the joint account that Maren had funded herself, ordered for an anniversary that had never quite arrived, for a marriage that had been decaying longer than either of them had named out loud. Preston did not look embarrassed. He looked inconvenienced. And in front of 6 board members, 2 senior advisors, and a room full of people who had spent years watching Maren Tate quietly hold things together, he demanded that she bow her head and issue an apology to the woman who had taken what was hers. The room waited. Maren glanced at her watch. 10 minutes later, a single call was placed, and every asset registered under Preston Hale and Celeste Mercer was frozen solid. Never force a woman to stay silent and apologize when she already has the evidence counted, documented, and ready to move. Maren Tate had not always been invisible, and anyone who had known her in the early years of Hale Meridian Group would tell you that without her, there would have been no company worth mentioning. The firm had started as a mid-sized commercial real estate venture in Lower Manhattan, underfunded, overextended, and 6 weeks from default, when Maren spent 3 consecutive weekends calling every contact she had cultivated during 7 years in private equity to pull together an emergency capital bridge that kept the lights on. She had redesigned the investor pitch herself, reworked the revenue model, negotiated the terms of the first institutional partnership, and handed Preston a company that had gone from near bankruptcy to a growth trajectory that made his name worth knowing in the right circles. By the time Hale Meridian had its first headline deal, Preston was the one giving interviews, and Maren had been quietly suggested, first gently, then with increasing pressure, to step back from the public side of the business because, as Preston put it, 2 voices created confusion, and the market responded better to a single face. She had agreed because she trusted him, and because the work itself mattered more to her than the credit, and because she was 32 years old, and believed that what was built together would be protected together. That turned out to be the most expensive assumption she ever made. By the time Celeste Mercer arrived as Preston's executive assistant, Maren had already noticed the slow erosion of her presence inside the company she had helped build. She was no longer copied on certain investment memos. Her access to one of the shared financial dashboards had been quietly downgraded without explanation. When she asked questions in meetings, Preston had a habit of redirecting the conversation before she finished speaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just smoothly enough that most people in the room did not notice the pattern until they had seen it enough times to recognize it for what it was. Celeste's arrival accelerated the shift in ways that were difficult to name at first, but impossible to ignore once they had accumulated. Within 4 months of joining as an assistant, Celeste had been given a private office, a company credit line, and the authority to approve scheduling decisions that had previously gone through Maren. Senior staff began consulting Celeste on matters they would formerly have brought to Maren directly. The balance of quiet authority in the building had shifted, and everyone felt it even if no one said so plainly. Maren did not confront anyone. She watched instead. She had learned a long time ago that a direct accusation without evidence was just an argument, and arguments could be managed, spun, and turned against the person who raised them. What could not be managed was documentation. She had noticed that a secondary savings account she and Preston maintained for property acquisitions had dropped significantly in balance, without a corresponding purchase appearing on any statement she could access. A brokerage account she co-owned had been restructured with new beneficiary designations that had not been discussed with her. A real estate LLC she had been a founding member of showed a change in operating agreement that had been filed 6 months earlier, quietly, without her signature on the updated documents, because the amendment had been structured in a way that technically did not require it. None of these things taken alone were conclusive, but taken together they formed the outline of something deliberate, and Marin was someone who understood outlines. She called Fallon Briggs on a Tuesday evening, explained what she was seeing without editorializing, and asked her oldest friend from her years in finance to look at everything with the kind of trained skepticism that forensic accounting requires. Fallon agreed without hesitation, and together they began building the file that would eventually end everything. She had not yet made her move when the bracelet appeared. It was a Tuesday in mid-October, when the Hale Meridian Board gathered for its quarterly review, a routine meeting held in the 42nd floor conference room, with its wide view of the Hudson and its long glass table that had been the setting for more significant decisions than most people in the building realized. Marin had taken her usual seat near the end of the table, the one she had occupied for years with no particular fanfare, and she had been listening to a capital deployment update when Celeste walked in, carrying a set of amended quarterly projections, and set them at Preston's right hand with the practiced ease of someone who believed she belonged in that room. It was when Celeste reached across the table that Marin saw it, a thin gold cuff with a sapphire inset at the center clasp, custom-made, distinctive, the exact piece that Marin herself had commissioned from a jeweler on the Upper West Side 14 months earlier as a personal gift to herself, for a milestone she had been quietly working toward, charged to the joint account in the amount of $4,200, and never delivered, because the jeweler had sent delivery confirmation to Preston's office rather than to Marin's direct address, and after that the conversation had simply gone quiet. She had assumed the package had been misplaced. She had not pursued it because there had been 100 other things demanding her attention, and a bracelet seemed like a small grievance compared to everything else that was already beginning to feel wrong. Now she understood where it had gone. She did not gasp or change her expression. She waited until there was a brief pause in the presentation, and then she asked, in the tone one uses to inquire about a minor procedural detail, where Celeste had gotten the bracelet. The question landed in the room with the weight of something much larger than it appeared on the surface, and every person present understood immediately that this was not a casual observation about jewelry. Celeste paused a half-second too long before answering, a pause that anyone trained to watch people under pressure would have recognized as the involuntary hesitation of someone deciding how much truth to offer. She said Preston had given it to her as a token of appreciation for her dedication to a particularly demanding quarter, her voice carrying the studied warmth of someone performing modesty they do not actually feel. The board members shifted in their seats. Meredith Langston, seated 3 chairs down from Preston, looked at the table. 2 other members exchanged a glance that communicated everything they were too professional to say aloud. Preston did not look at his wife. He looked at the projection screen and let the silence do what silence does in a room full of people who are deciding what to believe. Marin asked, still quietly, whether the gift had been purchased through personal funds, and Preston's jaw tightened just enough to tell her everything she already knew. He told her she was creating a scene where there was none, that she was allowing personal insecurities to contaminate a professional environment, and that her behavior was exactly the kind of thing that made it difficult to include her in important conversations. He said this in the flat, measured tone of a man who had rehearsed being wronged by his own wife, and there was a particular cruelty in how smooth it came out, because smoothness in the face of injustice is its own kind of violence. Marin held his gaze without blinking. She asked, one more time, whether he wanted to address the origin of the purchase in front of the board, or whether he would prefer to discuss it separately. Preston pushed his chair back, rose to his full height, and told her to apologize to Celeste for the disruption she had caused. The room went completely still in the way that rooms do when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. When the social contract has been broken so cleanly in front of witnesses that everyone present feels the wrongness of it in their chest, before they have consciously processed what just happened. Preston Hale stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who fully expected compliance, because compliance was what he had received from Marin for years. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the accumulated pattern of a woman who had chosen her battles carefully and had allowed herself to be pushed further and further from the center of a life she had built. Celeste sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes downcast in the way that suggests injury without fully committing to it, a performance so practiced it had become reflex. The board members did not look at Marin, which told her more than their words could have, because people who feel complicit look away from the evidence of their complicity. Preston said, with absolute evenness, that Marin had insulted a valued member of his team in a professional setting, and that the appropriate response was an apology, not a prolonged interrogation about jewelry. He called her behavior controlling. He said she had never understood the pressures of actually running a company at this level. He used the word unstable once, carefully, and let it hang in the air like something he had only reluctantly offered. Marin looked at him the way you look at a person whose face you have memorized so completely that you can see through it to everything it is hiding, she said, without raising her voice by even a fraction, that she was not going to apologize to the person currently wearing a bracelet, purchased with her own money, and delivered to her husband's office without her knowledge. Preston said she was being paranoid and irrational. He said the account in question was a shared business account, and that he had every right to make discretionary purchases from it. He said if she had a problem with that, she could have raised it privately rather than weaponizing a board meeting for a domestic grievance. He said the word domestic as though it were a kind of verdict, as though the fact that she was his wife rather than a business partner meant that her financial concerns were somehow categorically lesser than those of anyone else in the room. Marin was quiet for a long moment. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She reached into the jacket pocket where her phone had been sitting since she walked in, pulled it out, opened a message thread, and typed 4 words to Sterling Quinn. "Begin. We are ready." Then she set the phone face down on the table and told Preston, calmly and without drama, that she would not be apologizing today or on any other day. She looked at her watch. The clock began. The 10 minutes that followed were the quietest of Marin's professional life, which is another way of saying they were the most intentional. Preston continued the meeting as though nothing had shifted, which was itself a kind of desperation dressed as confidence. Celeste leaned toward Marin once during a presentation and said, barely above a whisper, that Marin might want to consider how she came across to the people whose opinions actually mattered in this building. Marin said nothing back. She did not need to. She had already said everything that needed saying, and it had been said in 4 words, sent to a man who had spent the better part of 3 months preparing a legal structure that could not be undone by a good attorney on the other side, because it had been built by one of the best. 40 blocks south of the Hale Meridian Tower, in a 4th-floor office, in the financial district that smelled of printer paper and cold coffee, and the particular kind of focused tension that comes from working with numbers that mean something consequential. Fallon Briggs was sitting at her desk, assembling the last section of a file she had been building for 11 weeks. The file was meticulous in the way that only a forensic accountant with a personal stake in the outcome can make something meticulous, not merely accurate, but constructed to be understood by a judge, a bank compliance officer, and a board of directors simultaneously, without ambiguity or room for the kind of counter-narrative that sophisticated lawyers are paid to construct. She had organized the documentation into 5 categories, each with its own index and a summary page that could stand alone if necessary. Wire transfers from the joint marital account to 3 limited liability companies registered in Delaware with no disclosed connection to Preston's public business filings. Personal property acquisitions including jewelry, a vehicle registered in Celeste Mercer's name, and a deposit on a Tribeca condominium made with funds whose origin traced back to the founding capital reserves of Hale Meridian Group. Stock certificate transfers on restricted shares that Marin had been issued as a co-founder, and which had been quietly reassigned through a series of procedural steps that were individually explainable, but collectively constituted a pattern. An offshore investment vehicle registered in the Cayman Islands, with Celeste listed as the beneficial owner and Preston as the managing designee, and a set of email exchanges between Preston and his personal attorney, discussing the strategy for what he had referred to in writing as restructuring exposure before the formal process begins, which was a careful way of saying he had been planning to strip the marital estate before filing for divorce. When Marin's signal came through, forwarded by Sterling Quinn with a single word appended, "Confirmed," Fallon attached the final packet to a secure file transfer and sent it to Sterling's office, then picked up her phone and dialed the direct line for the compliance department at Preston's primary financial institution. She identified herself, referenced the legal hold order that Sterling had already submitted through the court's emergency filing system 40 minutes earlier, and confirmed that the documentation had been transmitted. Sterling, for his part, had spent the previous hour on calls with 2 additional institutions and with the registrar overseeing the Delaware LLCs, each of whom had received copies of the Emergency Asset Preservation Order that he had filed at 8:45 that morning under the provision that allows for immediate injunctive relief when there is documented evidence of imminent dissipation of marital assets. He had done this kind of work before. Sterling Quinn had been practicing family law with a financial specialization for 38 years, and he had seen every variation of hidden money and false documentation that a wealthy man with a good attorney could devise. But he told his associate afterward that this file was among the most thoroughly prepared he had ever received from a client. Marin Tate had not panicked. She had documented. Preston's phone began vibrating on the table in front of him. At the exact moment, the second hand on the conference room clock completed its 10th revolution since Marin had set hers face down. Preston glanced at the screen and saw a number he recognized as his private banking contact, the same woman he had spoken to 3 weeks earlier to inquire about processing a transfer that his attorney had flagged as time-sensitive. He excused himself with the automatic ease of a man accustomed to being important enough to interrupt a room, stepped toward the glass partition at the room's edge, and answered. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. When he returned to the table, the color in his face had changed in the specific way it changes when the body receives information that the mind has not yet fully processed. Not pale exactly, but drained, as though something essential had been quietly removed from behind his expression. He set his phone on the table. He picked it up again. He opened his email, scrolled once, closed it. His investment account had been locked pending a compliance review, triggered by the Emergency Asset Preservation Order, filed that morning in New York County Supreme Court, under the case number attached to his wife's divorce petition, a petition that had been filed by Sterling Quinn at 9:15 that morning, 45 minutes before the board meeting had begun, and which Marin had signed the previous Thursday in Sterling's office with the same unhurried handwriting she used for everything. Celeste received her notification 3 minutes later. The account that had been established in her name 18 months earlier, into which Preston had directed a portion of the LLC distributions, the jewelry purchases, and the condominium deposit, had been flagged by the bank's compliance team in response to a formal inquiry from counsel identifying the account as connected to an active asset preservation dispute. Her corporate card, which had been funded through a subsidiary of Hale Meridian Group that Preston had quietly restructured to give Celeste signatory authority, was suspended. A property transaction she had not fully understood she was a party to. The Tribeca condominium that Preston had told her was an investment he was handling, had been blocked by the title company after receiving notice from Sterling's office. She stood up from her chair and looked at Preston with an expression that, for the first time, contained something other than confidence. She asked what was happening, in a voice low enough that the board members closest to the door could not quite hear the words, only the tone of them. Preston did not answer her. He was reading something on his phone with the focused stillness of a man doing rapid arithmetic on how bad things actually were. Sterling Quinn's number appeared on the room's shared conference line at 11:47. Marin answered it herself, which is when the remaining board members, who had been trying to maintain the fiction that this was a personal matter, understood that it was not. Sterling identified himself, referenced the case filing, and stated clearly and without legal decoration that as of that morning, all financial assets, property interests, and corporate instruments bearing the name Preston Hale or Celeste Mercer, individually or jointly, were subject to emergency preservation, pending the resolution of proceedings that included allegations of fraudulent transfer of marital property. He requested that the board take no further action on any financial matter, requiring the CEO's signature until independent counsel had reviewed the transactions in question. The room did not react audibly. It did something worse. It went completely silent in the way that means everyone understands exactly what they are hearing. From this moment forward, Sterling said, every asset connected to Preston Hale and Celeste Mercer is being held under emergency order. Fallon Briggs joined the conference room via video call 8 minutes later, her screen appearing on the wall-mounted display that Preston had used an hour earlier to present projected earnings. She did not begin with context or explanation. She opened the indexed file and walked the board through it, section by section, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has lived inside a set of numbers long enough to know exactly which of them will be most devastating to hear out loud. The 3 Delaware LLCs, she explained, had been established 14 months earlier using seed capital that traced directly to a Hale Meridian Reserve Fund that Marin had been a signatory on since the company's founding, a fund designated for capital preservation, not distribution, and whose diversion for any other purpose required written authorization from both co-founders. No such authorization had been obtained. The combined value of funds moved through those entities over the 14-month period was approximately $2,400,000, and a portion of that amount had been used to acquire personal property, including the bracelet currently sitting on the conference table in front of Celeste Mercer. A larger portion had been directed into the offshore vehicle registered in the Caymans, where it sat under Celeste's name in a structure designed to be difficult to trace quickly. Difficult, but not impossible, for someone who knew what they were looking for and had the patience to look. The stock transfers were, in some ways, even more significant than the cash movements. Marin had been issued founding shares in Hale Meridian at the company's inception, shares that carried not only economic value, but certain governance rights, including a consent right on major transactions, that Preston had spent the better part of 2 years trying to procedurally dilute without triggering the explicit protections built into the founding documents. He had succeeded in reducing her formal board representation, but had not fully extinguished her consent rights, which meant that several of the most significant deals the company had closed in the past 18 months had been executed without an authorization they technically required. Meredith Langston stopped typing her notes and looked up. The 2 board members, who had been exchanging glances throughout the morning, exchanged one more. Preston was looking at the table. Celeste was looking at Preston. Marin had not moved from her chair. She had not adjusted her posture or her expression since Sterling's call had ended. When Fallon finished her summary, the room waited for Marin to say something that would tell them how to feel about all of it. Instead, she said this, simply and without inflection. I did not freeze those assets because of a bracelet. I froze them because he was planning to steal my entire life, while making me look like the unstable one. Celeste turned and looked at Preston. It was the first time all morning that her expression had contained something that looked, unmistakably, like fear. Preston Hale had been constructing narratives his entire professional life, and he was very good at it, which is how he had convinced a board of experienced investors that his company's success was the product of his own singular vision rather than the infrastructure a brilliant woman had quietly built beneath him. He began, in the minutes after Fallon's presentation, to attempt what he had always done when cornered by an inconvenient truth. He tried to reshape the frame. He told the board that Marin's legal action was a retaliatory strike by a woman who had been struggling with paranoia and resentment for years, who had spent recent months obsessively monitoring his communications, because she could not accept that the company had evolved beyond the role she had played in its early stages. He said the asset movements in question were ordinary business decisions made within his authority as CEO. He said the LLC structures were legitimate tax vehicles that any competent financial officer would recognize as standard practice. He said Celeste's name appearing on certain documents was an administrative convenience, not a conspiracy. He delivered all of this in the controlled, authoritative tone of a man who had spent decades being believed in boardrooms, and for a moment the room hesitated. Then Marin asked Fallon to pull up the email thread dated the previous February. The email thread was between Preston and his personal attorney, not his corporate counsel, and it contained 23 messages over a 10-day period. The subject line read pre-distribution timeline. The content included a sentence in Preston's own language, unambiguous and unadorned, in which he stated that he needed the major transfers completed before there was any formal reason to file, or the numbers would be scrutinized the wrong way. There was a follow-up message 3 days later in which his attorney cautioned that the timeline was aggressive, and a reply from Preston that said simply, "Move faster." Fallon also displayed a series of text messages recovered from a backup submitted in response to the legal hold order. Messages between Preston and Celeste from 18 months earlier in which Preston had told her he was going to reorganize his financial situation before making things official, and in which Celeste had responded with enthusiasm that suggested she understood exactly what he meant. The board was very quiet. Preston said the emails were being misread. He said the texts were taken out of context. He was saying this with increasing speed and decreasing coherence when Meredith Langston raised her hand flat in the gesture that, in that room, meant stop talking, and called for a formal suspension of the meeting. Marin stood and said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, "I will not be apologizing. I will be requesting a full accounting." The realization did not come to Celeste Mercer all at once. It came the way cold comes when you have been inside long enough not to notice the temperature dropping, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, comprehending chill that spreads through you before you have consciously identified what you are feeling. She had understood herself to be the person Preston had chosen over the life he had before, which is a particular kind of story that a particular kind of ambition makes appealing. The story where the second woman is not a mistake but an upgrade, where being chosen means something about your value rather than something about his character. She had believed that the accounts in her name, the property, the authority she had been given inside the company, were the beginning of something being built for them both. She had not understood, or had perhaps chosen not to examine closely, that her name had been placed on those instruments not because Preston wanted to give her security, but because her name provided him with distance. Because if the transfers were ever challenged, having them in her name created a layer of separation between the money and the marriage that his attorneys could argue was evidence of a separate arrangement, rather than concealment of marital assets. She had not been chosen, she had been placed. When the full scope of what the documentation showed had been laid out on the screen, Celeste turned and asked Preston directly, in front of everyone, whether he had put her name on those accounts to protect her or to protect himself. The question landed with the weight of something that had taken longer to ask than it should have. Preston said that was an unfair characterization of a complicated situation. Celeste said she needed a clearer answer than that. Preston said his attorneys would explain everything in a more appropriate setting. Celeste understood from this that the answer was the one she had already arrived at by herself. She sat with that understanding for a long moment, and then she looked at Marin. Not with the expression of someone seeking forgiveness, but with the expression of someone who has just correctly identified the only person in the room who had told the truth by not speaking. Marin did not soften toward her. But she said, in a voice that was careful and without cruelty, that if Celeste was willing to provide full access to her communications, her account records, and her recollection of every conversation in which Preston had described the financial arrangements, the legal team would be able to distinguish clearly between what Celeste had knowingly participated in and what had been done using her name without her full understanding. It was not an absolution, it was a door. Celeste walked through it. She reached up and removed the bracelet from her wrist. She set it on the conference table with a small, definitive sound. "I don't want to keep this," she said, and she meant more than the bracelet. Meredith Langston had been a member of the Hale Meridian Board for 5 years, and in that time she had built her professional assessment of Preston Hale on the consistent performance of a man who appeared to know exactly what he was doing, and surrounded himself with people who confirmed that impression. She had been, if she was honest with herself in the weeks that followed, too willing to accept the picture he offered, because it was a coherent picture, and coherent pictures are easier to trust than the more complicated reality of what actually builds a company. She had also been subtly influenced by the fact that Preston had always introduced Marin in ways that positioned her as peripheral, the supportive spouse who had stepped back from business to manage their personal life, and she had not pushed back on that framing because it had not occurred to her that it was a framing rather than a description. The documentation changed that, because documentation does not have a point of view, and the documents showed clearly that the woman Preston had described as peripheral had been the financial architect of everything the board had been approving for years. Meredith called the formal vote herself. She motioned to suspend Preston Hale's executive authority pending a full independent audit of the transactions identified in the forensic report. The vote was unanimous, which is another way of saying that when the evidence is clear enough, loyalty to a compelling personality has a hard time surviving in a room full of people who have a fiduciary obligation to someone other than their social instincts. Preston's signing authority was suspended by formal board resolution. A 3-member independent oversight committee was established to manage the company's financial operations until the audit was complete. Marin Tate was asked, by Meredith herself, whether she was willing to serve in an emergency advisory capacity alongside the committee, given her historical role in the company's founding operations, and she said yes without either pride or performance. Fallon Briggs was formally engaged as the independent forensic auditor on the recommendation of 3 board members who had already read enough of her work that morning to understand exactly how thorough she was. Sterling Quinn's office was designated as point of contact for all legal correspondence related to the asset freeze. Preston was asked to leave the conference room at 12:34 in the afternoon, which was the first time he had ever stood on the wrong side of a door in that building. He stood in the hallway for a moment, and then Marin walked out past him, and he asked her, in a voice stripped of its usual architecture, when she had started planning all of this. She stopped walking, considered the question, and said, "The day you decided I didn't need to know what was happening to my own money." She did not wait for a response. She had already heard everything she needed from him. The divorce proceedings that followed were not the proceedings Preston had imagined when he had begun planning the financial restructuring that was supposed to precede them. He had imagined, based on the advice of the attorney he had been consulting quietly for over a year, that by the time Marin retained counsel and began the formal process, the marital estate would have been sufficiently restructured to make a contested division far less costly than it would otherwise have been. He had imagined Marin arriving at the table with incomplete information and a limited time horizon to challenge what had already been moved. What he got instead was a wife who had been building her own file for 11 weeks, with a forensic accountant who knew exactly where to look, a lawyer who had already filed the asset freeze before the board meeting began, and a board that had voted to suspend his authority before he had fully processed what was happening. The negotiation he had planned as an asymmetric contest had become something else entirely before it started. Celeste cooperated with the investigation in full. She turned over her phone, her emails, her meeting records, and a detailed written account of every conversation in which Preston had discussed the financial arrangements with her. Her cooperation established clearly which actions she had knowingly participated in and which had been executed in her name without her substantive understanding. The legal outcome for her was significantly reduced in scope as a result, though it was not without consequence. Several of the accounts in her name remained subject to clawback proceedings, and her employment at Hale Meridian ended by mutual agreement without reference, which is the professional equivalent of being asked to leave quietly. Preston's attempts to reach Marin privately, through messages relayed through mutual acquaintances, through a letter sent to their home address, through a call to Fallon that Fallon did not return, all went unanswered in the same deliberate, consistent way. Sterling Quinn was the only channel through which Preston could communicate anything of substance, which is another way of saying that the man who had spent years controlling every variable of his wife's professional and personal standing had lost the ability to speak to her on terms he chose. He issued an apology through Sterling's office. Marin read it once and told Sterling that it was the apology of a man who regretted the consequences rather than the conduct, and that she had no use for it. She signed the forensic audit authorization with the same unhurried, practiced handwriting she had used for the founding documents of Hale Meridian Group 11 years earlier. 3 months after the board meeting, the restructuring of Hale Meridian Group was formally complete in its preliminary phase, and among the amendments made to the company's official founding documentation was the addition of Marin Tate's name to the co-founder designation that had been absent from every public-facing document the company had issued since its first year. It was a small change in terms of the physical paper it required, and a significant one in terms of what it corrected. The company's official history, as filed with the relevant regulatory bodies and updated in its public disclosures, now reflected what the earliest investor memos and capital agreements had always shown, that Hale Meridian Group had been built by 2 people, one of whom had been systematically removed from the record of what they had built together. Preston Hale's tenure as CEO was terminated by a formal board resolution citing a breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of the operating agreement's conflict of interest provisions, among other findings that the audit had surfaced. His departure was announced in a brief press statement that named no specific cause, which was a professional courtesy extended by Meredith Langston over the objection of at least 2 board members who felt the facts warranted more transparency. Celeste Mercer left the company on the same day, by the terms of her separation agreement. Fallon Briggs remained as independent forensic auditor through the completion of the asset recovery proceedings, and then transitioned into a broader advisory role that the new board found difficult to justify ending. Marin did not take a formal executive title at the company she had helped found. She declined the interim CEO role when it was offered, and instead worked with the governance committee to establish the kind of financial oversight structure that, had it existed years earlier, would have made what Preston did considerably more difficult. She pushed for dual authorization requirements on any transfer above a defined threshold, independent audit access as a standing board right rather than a triggered exception, and the formal documentation of founding equity in all public filings, regardless of which executive was currently serving as the company's public face. These were not dramatic gestures. They were structural ones, which is the kind that last. Preston Hale, in the months that followed, found that the world he had operated in was a smaller place than he had previously imagined, and that the people whose professional regard had once sustained his sense of importance were proving harder to reach than they had been, before the proceedings became a matter of record. In the spring of the following year, a financial publication ran a profile of the restructured Hale Meridian Group, focusing on its new governance model and the role that forensic auditing had played in stabilizing the company after a period of leadership disruption. The journalist asked Marin Tate a question that had clearly been designed to invite a dramatic answer: whether a single phone call had really been enough to change everything. Marin thought about it for a moment before she answered, and the journalist noted afterward that the pause was not uncertain. It was the pause of someone deciding how much truth a question like that can hold. She said that the call had not created anything. It had only activated what had already been built: the records, the documentation, the patience of someone who had understood, long before that Tuesday in October, that the only way to defeat a person who controls the narrative is to make the evidence so complete that the narrative cannot survive contact with it. She said she had no particular feeling of triumph about what had happened, and that she was aware of how easy it is to mistake the collapse of something corrupt for a victory rather than simply a correction. She said the most important decision she had made in the entire process was the earliest one: to document rather than to confront, to build rather than to react, to wait until the evidence was sufficient rather than the emotion adequate. The bracelet was entered into the asset recovery record as a personal property item purchased with marital funds and returned to the estate inventory accordingly. It did not go back to Marin's wrist because it had ceased to be a piece of jewelry she had any interest in wearing. It had become something else: an exhibit, a line item, a small and specific piece of evidence in the larger account of what Preston Hale had taken and what Marin Tate had taken back. Preston and Celeste each had less than they believed was theirs, because the things they had believed were theirs had never been theirs to begin with. Somewhere in a midtown office building, in a conference room with a long glass table and a wide view of the Hudson, a nameplate had been affixed to the wall with 2 names on it instead of 1. Preston Hale had once forced his wife to apologize to his secretary in front of an entire boardroom, convinced that the silence he would receive afterward was the silence of a woman who had accepted her diminishment. But 10 minutes after Marin Tate looked at her watch and said nothing, a single call had frozen every asset he and Celeste had believed was safely beyond her reach. And the room that had watched him demand her humiliation came to understand, slowly, and then all at once, that the quietest woman in the room had not been silent because she had nothing to say. She had been waiting for exactly the right moment to lock everything.